It's time for us to check back in with the family history and stories of Opal Corn Myers. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist, and also look in the description below. The very first little link there will be a place where you could buy the book from the author if you would like to. Birth of Mama and Papa's children. Mama and Papa had 2 other children before I was born. Margaret May, or Maggie, was born January 9th, 1907, about 3 years after my parents were married. She was named after an old girlfriend of Papa's. How Papa ever got away with that, I simply don't know. Burl Bernard Corn was born December 4th, 1909, almost 3 years after Maggie. He was named Burl after the preacher, Burl Wilkes, and Bernard after the new warehouse in Greenville. Being so far from civilization, my folks had such a time getting the things they needed to run the farm. At last, they finally got this business in Greenville, Tennessee, called Bernard Warehouse. It must have been a very important event to name their first son after a warehouse. On February 1st, 1911, I was born, way back in the mountains of Cott County, in an area just under Hall Top. Much of that area had been owned by the Halls for many years, and it remained in the family for as long as the older people were still living. If my mama could have populated all of Cott County, she would have. My parents liked children and wanted a lot of them. I was the 3rd of 6, born just 1 year and 2 months after Burl. Mama named me Opal after Opal Odell, who was a first cousin to Lawton Turner and a little younger than Mama. She may still be living, but I really don't know. Mama would always talk about how Opal was the prettiest person she had ever seen. Even after I was grown, she'd tell me about how pretty Opal was and how she wanted to name me after her. Having babies was different back then. After a woman had a baby, someone from the community would come in and stay with her, that is, unless she had a family to help. The women in the family and neighbors would come in to help bathe the baby and cook meals for the family. The people were awfully good about helping like that. I don't think anyone stayed with Mama when I was born, other than the midwives that helped with the delivery. One was named Cassie Ball, and the other was Aunt Jane. Since it was winter, Papa would have been in the house most of the time, and Maggie was 6 years old, so she was old enough to get a drink of water for Mama or to fetch whatever she might need when Papa went out to feed the animals. I don't know much about my birth other than the date, like if I was born in the morning or in the night. I don't remember hearing anyone say. I never got my real birth certificate, so I probably will never know. When I needed a copy of my birth certificate to show the Social Security Commission, I discovered there had been a real big mix-up of recording my birth. My certificate said I was a boy named Audie, born on the 15th of February. Now, I had been told all my life that I had been born on the 1st of February, and I certainly knew for a fact, especially after all this time, that I was not a boy. All the other information, like my Mama and Papa's names, was correct, and it had been signed by one of the midwives. I don't know how it happened, but there appeared to be no record of my ever being born. By the time the mistake was discovered, both the midwives and Mama had died, and there was no one to ask. I took my birth certificate to the county clerk of court, who said, "You better just burn that certificate. You go down to the Social Security office and hand them that birth certificate with an entirely different name on it, saying you're a male child, no less. They're going to think there's something kind of phony about it. It'll confuse them something awful, and you'll never get it straightened out." So all I could do to prove that I had been born was write to the Census Bureau and ask them for the listing of children born to Arthur Jackson Corn and Flora Louise Hall Corn. When it came back, they showed me listed in the 1920 census as the 3rd child born to Arthur and Flora Corn, the 1st of February. That was the only way I could prove who I was. A lot was going on around the time my Mama was due with me. My parents had found out in January, about a month before my birth, that they had lost their lease on the cabin and land. Mama and Papa said that a man decided he wanted their place and went to the government office in Greenville and offered them $5 an acre. He was given the lease. That's exactly what they did in a government area. If someone was willing to pay more, they could take your land lease. My parents received the eviction papers in January, but because Mama was pregnant, they were allowed to stay until 2 weeks after my birth. My parents were not the type to be bitter and hold grudges. I'm sure they were hurt and upset, but they never said anything against that man. You would never hear them say anything like that. I knew who the man was that got our home, but my parents never would let us talk against him. They said that talking about the bad things that people did was wrong and could cause trouble along the way. Mama never would let us talk like that. She always said that a person's sin would find them out, but her family was not going to be the ones doing the talking, and we didn't. On February 14th, Papa loaded up the wagon. They didn't have much to move. People didn't have much back then. There wasn't room for a lot in the small 1 or 2 room cabins, especially when the average family had 6 to 10 children. There were no heating stoves to move. The fireplace was their only source of heat. They didn't have dressers or any other furniture except beds, chairs, and a table to eat on. The biggest thing they had was their cook stove. Just one wagon full would move it all. Papa hooked the 2 oxen up to the wagon. There had been a big deep snow the night before, but the oxen were strong and should have had no problem pulling the wagon. He put Maggie and Burl in the wagon. Mama wasn't able to ride in the bumpy wagon with a 2-week-old baby, so she had to carry me in her arms as she walked the 5 or 6 miles with her long dress and petticoats dragging through the deep snow. Of course, back then, nobody ever heard tell of women wearing pants. Several people knew what that man had done to our family, and since he was not from the community, he really had 2 strikes against him to start with. He wasn't much welcomed. He stayed here for a while, then started going back and forth to work other places. His family stayed, even though they weren't accepted by the people either, and yet they still kept that land for some time. The last time I saw that old man was after I had begun teaching. I was getting on the train to go visit the teacher I had stayed with when I was going to school in Kentucky. It was her niece that had helped me get my teeth fixed. There were several people on the train that I knew. One of them was my cousin, Harrison Pack, who was going back to his work. Another one was a lady from Del Rio, married to a government man who had something to do with the railroad. And there, about halfway back in the car, was that man. He was a sickening man. I tried to ignore him, but he kept saying something to me, something about my boyfriend. He was talking about his first cousin, and it just sort of irked me. No, it really irked me for him to say that about his first cousin, calling him my boyfriend. I couldn't have been less interested. He just had the one child born here. I don't know where the other children were born. One of his boys married and had 2 children here. When his wife died, he moved back to North Carolina, where the family was from. It's a shame I never did get to see the cabin where my parents lived when I was born, except for the times when we walked back up there when I was a child. By the time I started going back to Halltop, the government had taken back the leased land and all the houses had been torn down. The land had become part of the Cherokee National Forest, and there was nothing there to show where Mama's pretty little cabin had been, except for the thick growth of honeysuckle and kudzu. It never seemed right to me how the government did their business. There had been houses all up in this hollow, too, pretty log houses where people had lived for years, rearing their children and raising their crops. When the government stopped leasing the land, the people were given the opportunity to buy their houses and buildings and haul them off to a new location. If they couldn't afford to buy land and move their house, it was burned to the ground. If the houses remained, squatters might come in, and with them came the danger of forest fires. So most were forced to leave their homes and start over, but that's just how it was, and families dealt with it. Early childhood, 1911 to 1915. By the time you read this, Lori, I'm sure it will sound like I grew up in a third world country, but some things haven't changed too much since my day. Like families today, back then it wasn't at all uncommon for people to move from one place to another. especially if they lived on leased land. A family might build a little cabin on government land, decide they didn't like that one, get a new lease, and build another cabin. Usually a place became known by the builder's name. Everybody still calls the cabin up from my house the Hoss Click House, and the place Papa lived was called the Otter Place. Later, there were some families who bought land and built cabins, but then decided to rent them out so they could move to South Carolina where people were getting good paying jobs. We moved from Halltop to an empty cabin that had been built on some government land by George Jones. We leased the George Jones place for about 1 year and then moved to the Davis place, which belonged to some of the Click heirs, before moving up to Grandpa Hall's. We didn't live at either the George Jones place or the Davis place long enough to prepare the ground to plant much of a crop, but we always had a vegetable garden, and of course everywhere Mama lived she planted flowers. That's one thing you could be sure of. She loved her flowers. Before long, Mama and Papa were tired of moving. They wanted to have a home of their own, one that would always be theirs, so they would never have to move again. Grandpa Corn was trying to get things straightened out so he and Papa could buy a large piece of land bordering his property. They had started saving some of the calves they were raising and planned to sell a portion of their crops to use towards a down payment on the land. Living at Grandpa Hall's, 1913. Grandpa Hall offered to let us stay in one of the tenant houses on his nice big farm by the creek until we could afford to buy our own place. The tenant houses weren't really all that close to the main house. Why, I guess our cabin was about as far away from Grandpa's as we are from here to Clark's. Even though Mama didn't like having to stay at Grandpa's place, she knew it was the best thing for us to do. It was also good for Grandpa. He was getting older, and working the farm was getting more difficult for him. Mama didn't go around her pa much at first, but I think during the almost 2.5 years we stayed there, the relationship with Mama and her family improved considerably. Grandpa's place had at one time evidently been some kind of a big working farm. It had several different outbuildings, including a barn, cribs, chicken houses, hog houses with pens, a smokehouse, a well house, and a couple of storage buildings. There was even a building that was once used as a commissary when the original owners had the farm in full operation. A commissary would be like a small general store where workers would take the due bill they received for their work and cash it in for food and sometimes other things they needed. Back then the houses were tiny, only 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 rooms, counting the lean-to kitchen. Sometimes the finer cabins would have an upstairs sleeping loft. Families with 6 to 12 children were not at all uncommon, so a loft where the children could sleep and outside storage buildings could make all the difference in the world. Our little tenant house had 1 room with a lean-to. The 5 of us used the bigger room for a bedroom and put the cooking stove in the lean-to. My grandfather's house, on the other hand, was most unusual. It was actually 2 houses, one in front of the other, joined together by a catwalk, or a dog trot as we called it. The dog trot was like a big hall, about 6 to 8 feet wide, with no walls or ceiling. It was just like a big walkway between the 2 parts of the house. If it had been covered, this walkway would have made a fine place to sit and swing in the summertime. The front house, with its porch extending all the way across the front, had 2 rooms used as bedrooms. In the back house were the kitchen and dining room. Houses didn't have living rooms, but with 4 rooms, their house would have been considered large. I don't remember for sure if there was an outhouse. Most people didn't have them at that time. They would just go to the bathroom outside anywhere they wanted to. But if anyone back then had an outhouse, it would have been my grandpa. He just did not seem to be the type to be going to the woods to do his business. Our tenant house for sure didn't have an outhouse. People probably got the idea of outhouses from the mission people. There were plenty of animals around, and there was always a garden and crops to tend. Grandpa raised 4 or 5 cows at a time, calves, hogs, and chickens for food and money, and mules to help with the work. He never did raise goats. I guess he never saw much use in them. At that time, not many of the adults had much education, and many of them couldn't read more than basic words. I don't know if Grandpa Hall could read or write, but he certainly was pretty uppity. Both his family and the Clarks were kind of snooty. Charity Clark, like Uncle Lewis, was said to have been one of the descendants of the same family as William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The Clark family first settled in Virginia, then in North Carolina, and on into Tennessee. I guess being kin to someone famous might have made them feel like they were somebody special, but when you really got to know them, they were as common as could be. They didn't act a bit like they thought of themselves as better than other folks. They just did things differently. Grandpa Hall, in a unique sort of way, was a real sweet old guy, but it makes you wonder how he got to be so peculiar. My grandparents were the only people I ever knew of to have linen tablecloths, except for the chapel women. Chapel women, that's what most of the community people were now calling the mission workers. They also referred to the new church as the chapel, and the mission house was often referred to as the dwelling house. The chapel women were fancy eaters like Grandpa Hall. They used linen tablecloths and silverware, while the rest of us ate off of bare tables on simple plates with old knives and forks with black wooded handles. But more and more, little by little, the community women and the girls who attended the mission school started making things nicer in their homes too. They might spread a piece of cloth over the table and put some cut flowers in an old jar and place it in the center of it. The men folk usually didn't care much about such frivolous things, but if the women folk wanted to pretty things up, they wouldn't say anything, just as long as the food was on time. That's all they cared about. But not Grandpa. He was exactly that linen napkin type. There had to be a linen tablecloth on his table, and there had to be a big old white linen napkin folded and put on his plate for every meal. The silverware had to match, and it had better be laid out just right. The knife had to be in its place, the fork had to be in its place, and the spoon had to be in its place. Everything had to be precisely right. In the middle of the table was a big blue dish of honey. Everything had to be perfect, just exactly so. Grandpa was quite an elegant sight with that big white linen napkin stuck down his collar. Reckon he had to make sure he wouldn't get any crumbs on him. I don't know if he was raised that way or what. I really don't know anything about his family or where he got his unusual ways. The only things I ever heard about his family were rumors, like people said that his daddy, John Hall, was killed by a band of Yankee raiders during the Civil War and was buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery. Grandpa Hall was always kind of a mystery, both because of the rumors and because of his peculiar habits and actions. In all my years, I've never met anyone who even came close to being like my Grandpa Hall. After my mother ran away to get married, my grandparents always had a full-time live-in maid who slept in one of the front rooms. Of course, everyone in the community thought the maid was his mistress, but I didn't believe that. They were always older women who didn't look like they'd take much to being anyone's mistress. Grandpa kept the maid working hard, and with his strange eating habits and rituals, he kept her especially busy washing dishes. Grandpa always said his Charity wasn't going to wash no dishes, and she didn't touch a dish. Grandma Hall was a quiet and beautiful woman, rather regal and elegant in her ways, and Grandpa pampered her. Yep, my grandpa had some funny ways about him for sure. He ate 6 meals a day. The table was always set the night before with the plates upside down. When he got up in the morning, he would dress, come to the table, turn his plate over, and eat his breakfast. Then the maid would do the dishes and place them back on the table, plate upside down. At 10 a.m., he would have a snack of biscuits with jelly or honey, which he would eat on the bottom of the plate. If the plate had not gotten dirty, he would take his napkin, wipe it off, and place it back on the table, always upside down. If it were dirty, he would have the maid wash the plate. The maid had been instructed to never put his dishes away in the cupboard, but instead, each time she washed them, she was to put them back on the table, always upside down. At dinner time, which was their main meal, he would sit down at the table, turn his plate right side up, and eat a full meal. The maid would wash all the dishes after that meal. In the afternoon, he would again have a snack out of the bottom of his plate, the same routine over and over, If his plate was not dirty, he would wipe it off with his big linen napkin and leave it there upside down ready for supper. At supper, he would do the same as dinner time, and the maid would wash the dishes. So that was 5 of his 6 meals. Before going to bed, he would eat another snack out of the bottom of his plate. After wiping the bottom off with the napkin, he would leave it on the table ready for tomorrow's breakfast. Grandpa sure could eat, and it was a job keeping up with it. Grandma would help with the milking, but the maid took care of fixing the milk and butter. The maid did most of the work around there. That's another reason why I couldn't understand why people thought he was mixed up with some of those old ladies. Maybe it was because no one else around here had a maid. So fascinating. We'll stop right there for today. Such an interesting part. All of it's going to be interesting though, but really a wonderful peek back at Opal's early days there. I really love it. In the very beginning, I love how she's talking about she was the 3rd child, so she's talking about all their names and who they were named after, and even who herself was named after. And I love that her brother was named after the warehouse, because that was a business that was really important to her family and really helped. I have a great video, if you've not seen it, about names and how in Appalachia sometimes we change people's names. One that comes to mind is Sarah, might be Sari. Ina might be Einer. There's all those kind of things. But I talk about names a lot in that one, and you can go and I'll put the link in the description below if you've never seen it. It's pretty interesting. And I always say, if I was thinking about Corey and Katie when they were going to have their babies, I said you should go there and read some of the comments from other people and get name ideals. It's just a wonderful place if you wanted a unique baby name, wonderful place to go and read. All of our names, oftentimes that's how it is, people are named after different people. Granny's name is Evelyn Luzine, and the Luzine part, she was named after come way back before she was ever born. There's 11 children in her family, and she was the 3rd from the bottom instead of like Opal, the 3rd from the top. And so it would have been way back before any of those kids was born. Her father and her mother were working in Swannanoa, North Carolina, where Helene has done such horrible, horrible damage there. And he got in a logging camp, and he got sick, and he had to be put in the hospital. He had appendicitis, and they took his appendix out. And his nurse that took care of him was named Luzine. So somehow all those years later, they'd already had other kids. They decided to name Granny after her, so Luzine. It's an unusual name and a pretty name. And when Corey and Katie, of course, when they were going to, we were going to have twins, we knew Corey was a girl the whole time. We didn't know till we had Katie what she was. But we looked for different names and meaningful names and all that, and Matt really picked their names. And it's funny, we tease, but Kate his grandfather had a mule named Kate, so he says that's where Katie's name come from. And then he had a great aunt, Cora, and in the same way, her name was Cora, but they'd call her Corey, and then so we just used Corey. Anyway, fascinating about where names come from, and I love that Opal, that she shared that. And then really interesting about her birth certificate being wrong. You have to wonder if the midwife just mixed up the names, like she had the father and mother right on that one, but then the details of the little boy, and the different February date was maybe somebody else she had delivered. I don't know. Anyway, that was interesting, and to me interesting that the person told her, said, don't even go tell them that. Just throw that away and then figure out how to prove who you are, because that'll just make a mess out of it. I liked that part too. I don't do genealogy or anything like that, but I've been amazed by some of my friends who do genealogy. What they're able to find out from census reports and things like that is really, really fascinating. So if you're somebody that does that, you know that all the different details you can discover. And such a different time too there. She had made it, I think she said that she was going to get her Social Security, is why she needed that. So she'd already worked her whole career and done everything without a birth certificate, without, any kind of identification or whatever. I don't guess. Maybe she had a driver's license or something. I don't know though. She didn't mention that. But interesting, such a different time when that just wasn't something that people thought about. A lot of people from those days never had their birth certificate. They might have the family Bible where somebody had wrote it down what day they were born. Of course, today we have to have ID to do anything. We have to have proof of, even our children, when they're born, they're issued a Social Security card. You have to go through the little steps. I mean, you don't get it at the hospital, but still, even then. So it's such a difference in that. And then another real huge difference is easy to see when the man, unfortunately, outpays their lease, and they have to leave right after Opal was born, about moving. It all loaded into one wagon, and so there was 3 kids, one a newborn, but still, in our world today, newborns have a lot of stuff. So just one wagon's all it took, though, one wagon load. Such a difference today when you think about people that move. Even Corey and Austin, when they moved into my brother's house, they rented a U-Haul, they rented movers to move big furniture, but even before that, we made trips, all of us made trips back and forth bringing stuff. And I know Steve and Kim did the same thing when they left here and went to their new house. Again, they made trips, and then they hired people to move the furniture. So such a different time. I really admire Opal's mother, though, and her father, how they said, even though the man had done that, let's just don't talk about it. Just don't say nothing. Just don't talk about it. And didn't want them going around, talking bad about the man. So I really loved that. And the mother kind of said I guess, in a way, he'll get what he deserves at some point, but we won't have nothing to do with it because we're not going to be the ones talking about it. And the way she described them moving like that, now they wasn't moving great distances. They were in that same little general area, but they did move to those different places. And that really reminded me of Pap. Now, Granny's family, they moved a little bit when she was really young, and then after her grandmother died, they moved in with her grandpa, and then they didn't move no more. But Pap's family moved, again, in a small area, but from between here and Pine Log and 2 or 3 other places, and throughout Brasstown and Pine Log, several different places. And one time years and years ago, I got him to take me to all the different places that he could remember where they lived and showed me. And, I said, well, why did you move? Why did you move so much? And he said, well, for one thing, we didn't own those places. We had to pay to stay there. And, you're always thinking times would be better somewhere else. And so they just moved a lot until they ended up here in Wilson Holler. And then they moved several different places here. There's an old burnt down place up the creek, and then there's one down the road, and then there's the area kind of where we're at today. So that's interesting. Especially Opal's telling her granddaughter that she's writing all this for. Well, Barbara's writing it, but that she's documenting for her that those things hadn't changed. People move a lot, and people do move today, but I wonder if they move in those small little areas like that, like Opal was talking about, and like Pap's family did for sure. And then they finally land at Grandpa Hall's place in the last part we read. So you remember Grandpa Hall is the one that was really mean to the mother and her brother, to Opal's mother, and would be her uncle, and they both run away from home basically and left him. And he does sound very peculiar. But what I want to know, same thing Opal wanted to know, is where did he learn that stuff? Like, where did he learn that the table should be set, and the linen napkins and the tablecloth? He must have come from a family who did those things. Because where would he, you think about, she's saying it herself, kind of backwoods people, where would he get those fancy thoughts and fancy ways of doing things, and to the point that he done his every meal that regimented and orderly, that he wanted every meal like that. That's really, really fascinating. It makes you wonder, all those, just like Opal did, where did he learn that stuff and where did he get it? It does sound like while they were there, Opal's mother and him kind of mended their fences, maybe they settled some things, so that was really, really a good thing. Interesting, her talking about the outhouses too. Now, if you've listened to all the books that I've read, you'll remember, and if you've not, you can go back and listen, but Alex Stewart, the book about Alex Stewart, there was one part of that book that was just hard to read. It was so pitiful about people not understanding hygiene, or even, sanitation, not understanding it, and how they got sick, and they stayed sick a lot. And then the people that did kind of understand it were healthier. So that part, you might think, well, they just use the bathroom wherever. Wouldn't they mark out a place? Not according to Alex Stewart, and it sounds like that's what Opal's saying too, the same thing. And maybe it was those mission people that taught them about outhouses. So you can go back, though, if you missed Alex Stewart, and listen to that one. And another thing about Grandpa Hall that's interesting, we wondered before when the boy and the girl, when they run off, Opal's mother, that he let the boy go to school, her brother, but he wouldn't let her go to school, and then she had to do all the work. And the brother worked too, though. When he come home, he made him work too. But we wondered, like, well, what's the wife doing during this time? But then in this part, it tells us he really pampered her. He didn't make her. She'd never washed a dish, and she didn't. You know, I guess prior to this, Opal's mother washed them, and then once she left, he started getting the maids, and the maids washed them. So even that makes you think, did he come from such a wealthy family where that was like a, I don't know, like a status symbol, or just the status quo, I guess, that the mistress of the house didn't have to do anything. I don't know. That's interesting. But now we learn she wasn't going to be the one that done it, so maybe that's why she didn't care that he was so hard on the daughter. But even that makes you think, well, you didn't want your wife to do it, but then you wanted your daughter to do it. Of course, Opal couldn't figure it out, so we can't. But it's interesting to think about for sure. I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. I hope that you'll leave a comment and let me tell me what jumped out at you. What are the things that you found really interesting? I hope you'll drop back by next Friday. And again, if you're interested in buying the book, it's just right in the description right there. You can find the link to go to the author, Barbara League, that put it all together for Opal. You can go to her website, find out more about her, but also find out, where to get the book. And I hope you'll drop back by next Friday so we can find out what happens next.